right, everyone. Welcome back to Sharing the Brain. My name is Steve Magadance.
And I am Stuart Guthrie, joined here by the lovely Lolly, as you can see, joining us on screen.
And this is a little podcast about leadership. And I suppose it's worth, Stu, maybe a qualifier is that, you and I are both relatively new principals, relatively new to our position. So it is definitely certain that we don't know everything about anything that has to do with leadership, but we're interested in talking more about it. And that's what this podcast is about, and how we kind of came to the title of Sharing the Brain, because we did a lot of conversation when we were assistant principals together at a previous school.
Yeah, I think that's very well said. And, we're certainly not the experts on anything at all, other than just putting ourselves out there to talk about it. And a lot of times after these conversations that we've had in the past, or even these podcasts that we've gotten together on, I go back and do more research, involve other people. And, I've got some feedback from people that have watched them or pretended to watch them, depending on, all 7 people. But they've brought up topics as well. Last month with Jennifer Lomas talking about hiring, that started some conversations with people that I talked to. So yeah, I'm excited about it. So this episode, let me back up before I even get to that part. Steve and I do talk all the time. And I'll often say, hey, what do you have for our next podcast? What do you want to talk about? Oh, we'll kind of kick it back and forth. But the last time I asked him, just this past week, immediately you said productive struggle. I thought, okay, that's great. You seem very adamant. Tell me why that kind of jumped out to you, or why that was interesting.
Well, I think productive struggle it's one of those terms that's out there right now. I mean, I think it's along the lines of like, grit and perseverance. You hear it in some constructivist language out there. And when you do a search about it, you hear a lot about like how you create an environment where students are able to like deal with a challenge or a problem in a productive fashion, right? And struggle with it a little bit. And I think that you were telling me a little earlier that you hear that, or you see it a lot in like a math classroom, right? How do you present a problem and then allow students to struggle with it a little bit to come up with solutions that may address the problem, or come up with solutions with a problem. And it got me thinking about like how that happens in like a professional learning context, right? Like when you think about being like the leader of an institution or the lead learner in an institution, like how do you create a situation where you can present a challenge, present a question, and allow members of your community to struggle with it, for lack of a better term, and create some ideas about solutions, like really meaningful ideas about how to create change in an institution. I think that's where I came up with it. And honestly, I was sitting in an auditorium listening to a presentation about it, or at least didn't specifically address it, but got to what I thought was like the gist of this idea of like, how do we look at change maybe on a deeper level? That's where I came up with it.
No, and we did talk a little bit before we started. We planned for this podcast for at least 45 seconds today. So I was very excited about that prep for this. But I did do a little, I don't say research or lit review, but I did look into it just to see if there was like a formalized definition of what that meant. And the interesting thing that jumped out to me was the first probably 5 or 6 search returns were all about math. So I think if we want to talk about how that would look, on a school level, like maybe through professional development, which is another interesting search I'll tell you about in a second. But if we're going to do that, maybe we need to talk about what it looks like with kids, or how we've had kids that have come to us, our parents, to be fair, and their kids struggling. And how do you encourage them to continue on with that? And the one example I give, this is just one that just kind of jumps out. There's been many along the same kind of lines, is students not doing well in math, high school math, it could be algebra, geometry, or whatever, and goes home and tells the parent, well, the teacher's not helping me. And the parent, like we all want to, help our kids and be there for our kids, want to come to the school and see what's going on. Why is this teacher not helping me? The one example I'm thinking of, the teacher told the student, well, look at your notebook. And this is a class where they built a notebook with examples, problems worked, and it was really a nice resource tool that the kid could then take with them. But they could not, in their opinion, get the teacher to help them. And the only thing I came up with at the time, I used it afterwards, was like a basketball team. You would never expect to get better sitting on the bench watching others play basketball. You have to sweat. You have to get in there and, give some physical effort if you're going to get better at anything. And that kind of helped a little bit. But that's how I equated productive struggle to something I thought the kid could understand. What's a situation, Mags, that you've been in that might be something similar, or how do you approach that with a student?
Well, I think when I think about like the idea of struggle, I also think about the idea of growth, right? And I like your analogy with athletics, right? I mean, if you're going to hone a skill or get better at something, you have to struggle with it. You have to practice with it. You have to work on a technique, right? You have to work on some strategies to help you get better and grow. And I was a basketball player, right? And everyone has heard, well, if you're a basketball player, you may have heard the phrase beef before. I learned that when I was in high school, and it was about balance and extension and follow through and keeping your eye on your target. And it was all the pieces of shooting a basketball, right? But you had to work on that, right? Because it's not necessarily natural for you to get your elbow right down here to keep it in a nice square place so you can shoot. And I think that, I mean, it works really well in athletics. And I think oftentimes we want to know what maybe the steps are in a process for getting through to an answer to a challenge or to a question. But sometimes the answer isn't necessarily right in front of our face or isn't very prevalent. And so we have to hone some skills and practice some things and grow, and honestly, like, take some risks to do better, to find solutions that maybe work best in our practice or work best in our community or in our institution. And I think that's kind of how I think about it. And I try to do stuff with my community that creates some risk, but safe risk. And I think that's
Right.
the thing where, you know, productive struggle isn't going to be good if you have a situation where people don't trust each other. So even like a math classroom, like, students have to trust each other enough. Hi, Lolly, she's sitting up there behind you.
Hi, Lolly.
You have to trust each other enough to be able to give feedback, take feedback, wrangle around with a little bit of things, know who to ask questions of, how to ask the questions so that they're heard in the way that you need them to be heard, in order to, you know, bounce the idea back and forth. So if that trust doesn't exist there, you're not going to get to solutions that maybe meet the needs of, you know, all the members of the community, all the stakeholders.
Yeah, and I think, you know, when I was doing the quick little review about that, or the study about that, it talked about those exact same things. You know, the trust between the teacher and the student, and the support. You know, that you had the requisite skills leading up, the prerequisite skills leading up to what the task was, help the students overcome that. And one of the terms I saw, and I'll put a little link at the end of this to where I found it, was a researcher that talked about productive failure. And it was almost like the failure was predicted. And the one article I saw, you know, was a research, you know, a peer-reviewed research article where they gave two groups of students problems to solve. And one of them was an ill-conceived, what they called an ill-conceived math problem, put them in groups to solve it, while another group had a well-conceived math problem to solve. And then, of course, at the end of the study, they put them on similar questions. Well, the group that had the ill-conceived problem actually performed better because they had to identify the problem, identify what resources they had. And so I think that was really interesting. You know, you pay now, but you benefit later. So let's jump to professional development. And I know one of the conversations, Steve, you and I had was, are we talking about professional development like a 1 week shot, which I hate the idea of, like an event. It's just a one thing, we forget about it. Or like you said, for your community. So in thinking about that, what do you think about, how do we move it to, you know, teaching teachers or your community? How do you think how's that look to you?
Well, I mean, that's a good question. I don't know if I have necessarily great answers for it, but I do think that it is a question of the whole community. You're not necessarily talking about an event per se, but you might be talking about stringing together several experiences to develop some of that trust, to develop some of that collegial practice.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think that you could search protocols and things out there to do some of the basic surface level kind of icebreakers. And that's one good way to start, I think, but it's also about then doing the work, right? Like, what are the challenges, or what are the questions? What are the things that the community needs to try to solve? You know, for my community, my perception of it is trying to refine some of the structures that we have at the school, right? So how do I work with my colleagues to create situations where we can observe how things are working, ask the question, you know, who are these things serving? How well are they serving the folks that we believe they should be serving, and how can they serve folks better, right?
Yeah.
That's not a super specific example, but I think that's the idea of it. So you create this systemic way of addressing problems together, or addressing challenges or questions together, so that you work towards solutions that, again, like, serve members. And I think it's also about voice, right? We're not necessarily talking about just adults, in our own settings, although I think that's how we sometimes think about it as principals, is
Sure.
we are teachers of teachers sometimes, right?
Right.
But you're talking about all voices, right? So how do you, like, in the big picture, create opportunities for students, for parents, for, people who don't have students in your classroom, community members, to have voice in, making your community a stronger community?
Yeah. And I will just share, a couple days ago, we all sat down for dinner, and Steve's lovely wife, Julie, was there, who
She is lovely.
she is lovely. She's very lovely. And she assured me that she has not listened to the podcast yet, by the way. And so I said, well, neither is my wife. So they're going to have to get together and enjoy this wonderful podcast. But I was bringing up icebreakers because that is not one of my favorite things to do. And when I get into a training, or if I'm leading a training, the idea of sitting down and, okay, here comes the dry spaghetti and the marshmallows, and we're going to put this together. And I get it. I really do. I like, the collegiality. I like doing those things. But your wife, Julie, is the one that said, but really the authentic icebreaker, if you really want to get down to it, it's kind of like what you said, when you work together as a group, and I think one thing we're going to do, because PD week is coming up here pretty quickly, is work together in different groups, natural groups,
Yeah.
their departments, their teams, and, let them work through some things. But when you're talking about that, when you just said that a second ago, it's challenging because as a leader, it's tough to get up there and say, all right, I don't know the answer to this, but I want y'all to find the answer to this, because you have new teachers joining your faculty, and that's a tough one. It's tough to stand there and say that, but I think ultimately we know it's beneficial, and you get better answers when you have 65 people coming up with an answer rather than just one or maybe two in administration.
Yeah. I'll shameless plug here. There's a book that I've read out there called Leading for Powerful Learning. And, you talk about, like, it's tough to stand up there and say, I don't know the answer to the question. I need help from you guys. And then this book talks about, like, 3 different potential responses to that, right? Like, there's maybe a group of learners that you might call instrumental in this text that say, well, tell me the steps to get to the solution. Like, what do you need me to do? Right. And then there's a group that might be more socializing. You're like, all right, well, let's talk about it together. And then there's this third group that you might call, self-authoring, at least in this text, this book, that's pretty cool, where they go, all right, here's what I'm going to here's the plan I'm going to approach, or here's the approach I'm going to take, or here's the questions that it raises for me. Right. And you've got all 3 and people that are, somewhere in between in your institutions, right? So how do you also create an experience that gives each kind of learner what they need, like what's going to help them be most productive and valuable to the conversation? Like, how do you give some steps? How do you create some opportunity to talk about it? And how do you give people a chance to kind of go? Like, sometimes we call those folks, like, your early adopters. Like, so how do you create those opportunities for all of these groups of learners in a really diverse community to take on a problem and give feedback on a problem? And that's probably the biggest challenging. What are the right moves, right? And I think that's the other part of it, right, is productive failure, right? I know that I'm going to do some things wrong here in the next couple of weeks, right, to get my faculty prepared, right? I'm going to make some mistakes, or I'm going to make moves that aren't as productive as they could be. And so how do we also give ourselves some grace to make those wrong moves and create a situation when someone else makes a wrong move, or maybe a not as productive move, that we get some grace? And one thing that I'll maybe close on this a little bit with is, how do we get to a place where when I walk in the room, people don't go, something's wrong, and I think that's a key of something we heard a little bit earlier in this week. Like, how do we change a culture, or build a culture where it's just, you walk in, you're another member of the community, and, we keep learning together.
Right. Yeah. And I don't want to go off onto a tangent. It'd be easy to do it, but the same thing happens when you go into a classroom, and, the students just automatically kind of look over, and they want to, all of a sudden the whole tone of the classroom changes. And I think you're right. You get into an authentic kind of a learning community where people trust each other, that when the principal comes in, or administrator, or whoever comes in, nothing changes. It's just the same thing. So I would say this: we have 1 week, and then we're both back at the same time with our teachers and professional development week, or however you want to call that.
Mm-hmm.
Let's come back, when you do episode 4 or whatever, and talk about that, because it sounds like we both have some things built in where our teams are going to work together, hopefully struggle, hopefully fail in a positive way, and come out with the solution. So I'd like to hear how that kind of goes for you, and then I'll report back on my side.
I think that sounds great. I think it's also maybe pertinent at this point to say that we want to hear from our 7 viewers.
Absolutely.
To see what you have, and Lolly, to see what you think about this idea of struggle and creating a culture of learning that allows people to be comfortable with being uncomfortable, I guess, if that's a thing, or being comfortable with not knowing an answer right away and being willing to work to solutions. Yeah.
And I'll tell you, we have Lolly is like the star of the show today. You want to say something? She's yawning. That's a bad sign. And she is one of our viewers. So, but one thing that I think is exciting is we have several people that have come up to us about joining us as a guest. One is an assistant principal who I think would be great. Obviously, we spent most of our time in leadership as assistant principals, and then an executive director. How exciting is that, of curriculum and instruction? And I won't say who it is, but we'll give that person the opportunity to come join us, and it'll be exciting to talk about. But let's make sure that we talk about this next time we sit down and kind of give some feedback on how the productive failure, played itself out during our PD week.
That sounds great. And so I know that you're going to throw up some information at the end. We'll also say we have a new Twitter handle. At Sharing the Brain is out there. You may have seen it if you're one of the 6 people that watched or are at least following us on Twitter. So don't hesitate to shoot a comment, shoot some feedback. We will take all kinds, warm, cool, and even ideas for conversations later after we revisit about productive struggle and productive failure with our staff.
All right, awesome. Well, thanks, Mags. That was a lot of fun, and we'll do it again pretty soon.
Yeah, take care. Good luck with teachers coming back.
Amen to that.
Bye.
Bye.
All right, it's recording now.